In 1879, Johnny MacDonald imposed the National Policy Program. It was introduced when the country was facing an economic crisis. Plus, it was a way to stop relying on the US economically, as the American government wanted to consider a protectionist policy. High tariffs were imposed on foreign products, while raw materials and agricultural products were sold for less in Canada. This policy was popular in Ontario and Quebec, but not in Alberta. In fact, the manufacturers were able to limit their competitions, as their own products were less expensive than foreign goods. However, farmers had a smaller market to sell their own products. This policy favored the biggest cities, which were Montreal and Toronto. Rural communities were against it, as their economy was restrained. With these tariffs, money was spent on immigration and the construction of a railway in the West. It attracted even more settlers in Alberta. However, the National Policy Program still marked the beginning of the Western Alienation. The United Farmers of Alberta was created in 1909 and gained a lot of popularity at the end of the 1910s and early 1920s. They were the party protecting the interests of the farmers, as many of them feared for their jobs due to big corporations moving to Alberta. It is in 1921 that they will win the provincial election, and their reign will last for 14 years. They will improve the living conditions through education and health system, but also the financial states of the farmers. The UFA will also be a federal party, and many other provinces will have their own provincial version. Quebec and Ontario were either voting for the Liberals and Conservatives. The two provinces were starting to be more industrialized, as many corporate sectors started to appear. The UFA was more relatable to the western provinces, and the number of seats gained will never give them a voice in Ottawa. The Great Depression and the prairie drought will heavily affect the province financially. As promised, the Alberta Social Credit will put in place a program to help the farmers and won the 1935 election. They attracted voters from the UFA. Their program was based on the social credit policy, distributing money so that people could have enough income to purchase goods and services produced in the society. When the Prosperity Certificate was introduced in Alberta, the federal government judged that the system was unconstitutional. It was a certificate that was used to encourage the population to spend as a way to gain more advantages, such as tax reductions. The Social Credit Party of Canada was created in 1935 to apply this doctrine throughout the country. Once again, other provinces had their own version of this party. Only British Columbia elected a prime minister from this party, where Ernest Manning became the premier of Alberta under the Alberta Social Credit Party. The province will become more conservative. When oil was discovered at Le Duc in 1947, Alberta became one of the richest Canadian provinces when it was one of the poorest. The social credit doctrine was replaced with a more conservative financial and social policies. At the federal level, the Social Credit Party of Canada will decrease in popularity due to the province becoming more conservative. The party was unable to adapt to the political changes Alberta was facing. Therefore, the Progressive Conservative of Canada increased popularity-wise. In 1971, the Social Credit was defeated by the Progressive Association Party of Alberta by Peter Lougheed, which ended a 36 years reign. Due to the revenues generated by oil, the living conditions of Albertans increased significantly. The Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund was created to save money in the longer term. The Alberta government simply didn't want the federal government to intervene because they didn't want all the projects put in place to help Alberta in the long term be ruined. As in the past, Ottawa often intervened in the province, which resulted in a bad reaction from Albertans. As the separatist movement grew in the province of Quebec, policies to avoid a possible sovereign nation were introduced in Ottawa. To include more francophones in important positions, Canada became a bilingual nation. Multiculturalism was also a policy adopted in Canada, which meant that the country was composed by several people with different backgrounds. These were liberal policies that went against the conservative mindset of Alberta. Unhappy with Pierre Trudeau's policies, Albertans were considering a separation. The Independence Alberta Association was created, as the main criticisms were that Alberta was sending billions of dollars to the east, but also had a smaller representation than Central and Eastern Canada. The billions sent to the east was for a monetary system called equalization payment. It was based on the principles of sending money to Ottawa through federal taxes and then distributed it to other provinces. It was introduced in 1957 but was part of the Constitution of 1867. Quebec has received a larger amount of money due to the system, and that many claim that most of it comes from Alberta. However, I'm planning to do a separate video on the subject, as there are many numbers circulating around. Over the decade, the separatist movement will disappear under the rug, as many Albertans wanted to stay in Canada. However, the separatist movement resurfaced in the 1980s. In 1980, Pierre Trudeau introduced the National Energy Program, which caused outrageous reactions in Alberta. It was seen as a way to destroy the natural resources to favor Eastern Canada, where most of the seats were. This policy was in response to two major oil crises in the 1970s, where several countries in the Middle East imposed an oil embargo and ceased to export oil to the US and any American allies. The cost of the oil was more expensive, and some gas stations ran out of oil as a result. To avoid a lack of this natural resource, the Canadian government became more protectionist. It was a way to stop relying on other countries, as well as paying less for oil. Therefore, the price of Alberta's oil was sold lower than the global market prices. This policy had a negative impact on the province's economy. The surpluses the province enjoyed for years were reduced. As a response, Lougheed threatened to cease oil exportation to the rest of Canada. The price was then modified to match the international ones. Also, negotiations led the federal government to impose special taxes as a way to increase federal revenue. When the world was affected by recession in the early 1980s, Albertans connected the National Energy Program as a reason why the province also faced economic problems. It was another reason to dislike Trudeau. Many felt that he was disconnected and hated the West. His policies were more suitable to the East, especially to Quebec, as many of his programs were a way to calm the separatist movement. Under Trudeau's government, the separatist movement in Alberta wasn't taken seriously. He even suggested that the West should take a page from Quebec book to have more representation at the federal level. As for Lougheed, he stated that Albertans don't want to leave, but want to be more included at the federal level. What the federal Liberal has done will heavily influence the vote tendency of Alberta, as many, still today, avoid voting for this party. When the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada was elected under Brian Mulroney, Albertans were hopeful. He dismantled the unpopular National Energy Program as he promised. The separatist movement dissipated significantly. His government was a disappointment, as most of his MPs were from the East, which meant that Alberta's concern was ignored. During his reign, he was also trying to calm the separatist movement in Quebec throughout the Canadian Constitution, once again creating a discontent of the West. Due to this discontent, the Reform Party of Canada was created. The party was highlighting the favorism towards Quebec and the lack of representation of the West. Their slogan was "The West wants in the federal election of 1993. The party was the third opposition behind the Bloc Québécois. The requests were pushed aside as the headlines were focusing on Quebec's separatist movement, who gained a larger following in the 90s. In the 1997 federal election, they were the opposition party, while the Bloc Québécois third. However, the Reform Party of Canada failed to use their important position to voice their demands due to problems inside of the party. In 2000, the Reform Party of Canada was merged to the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, or the Canadian Alliance. It was a mixture of conservative and reformist policies. In the election of the same year, the party will maintain the opposition status. However, a series of political mistakes led to the decline of the party and the resignation of the leader, Stockwell Day. He was replaced by Stephen Harper in 2002. The Canadian Alliance and the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada were dissolved in 2003 as they remerged to the Conservative Party of Canada. The new party won the election of 2006. Stephen Harper chose, under his minority government, a cabinet mostly composed of Albertans. He also promoted the oil industry on the international stage, as it was a way to benefit Alberta and Canada as a whole economically. He was extremely popular in the West, as he was able to care about the interests. When he lost his election in 2015 to Justin Trudeau, Alberta's separatist movement rekindled. It was the return of the Liberal Party, this time under another Trudeau. Albertans thought once again that they would be ignored in favor of Quebec. This time, Quebec was under a nationalist government instead of a separatist one. It meant, instead of campaigning for a foreign nation, Quebec wanted to obtain more provincial jurisdictions. One of the biggest controversies before the 2019 election was the Energy East program. In order to avoid the importation of foreign oil and to help Alberta economically, a pipeline project was proposed. This pipeline had to cross British Columbia, but the province refused. Quebec also refused this project because of environmental risks. The project was cancelled, and some blamed Trudeau for allowing Quebec to refuse the project, especially when the province receives billions from the equalization payment, of which some is from Alberta. Again, I want to do a separate video on the subject to explain how it is working. As for the pipeline, Albertans wanted help from the East, as their economy needed it. So when Justin Trudeau won in 2019, the separatist movement rekindled. In addition, the Bloc Québécois became the third party, which meant that the needs of Alberta will once again be ignored or rejected. Its leader, Yves-François Blanchet, is against the construction of a pipeline. The opposition party was the Conservatives, but the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals combined have more seats. Keep in mind that the Bloc Québécois are not pro-Trudeau, just pro-Quebec, so any false steps made by him would be attacked. Since Quebec and Alberta vote differently, the Bloc is seen as anti-Alberta. The Exit Party, now known as the Maverick Party, has the support of thousands of people in Western Canada. Their slogan is, "How the West was won." This party is the Western version of the Bloc Québécois. The party is campaigning for separation of the West, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, as they believe that the government will still use the provinces to benefit the East, without caring about their own concerns. Due to the provincial governments, Albertans have been successful in dealing with their economic problems. They succeeded in building a strong and resilient province. Albertans have often been happy with their own government. For them, the problem lays on the federal government. First, the multiple interferences in the affairs of the province, which has sometimes hurt Alberta. There is also the misunderstanding of the West caused by the lack of listening and a lack of representation in Ottawa. This is mainly because of the small amount of seats in Alberta. The provinces with the most seats have more attention. Obviously, a candidate has to pander to gain more votes from these regions. Ontario and Quebec have always been different from Alberta, which is why their votes were never suitable for Alberta. I made this graphic that shows the number of seats in Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and Canada. In addition, the number of seats necessary to have a majority government. On the other side of the board, the most popular federal party in the three provinces and the party that won in the federal election. I only started in 1921, as it marked the beginning of Albertans building their province by themselves. If I were to do the math, if a candidate gets most of the seats in Quebec and Ontario, he doesn't need a lot of seats in Alberta or any other province to win. The most populous provinces are more likely to obtain the desired government. Since 1921, there have been 30 federal elections. 22 of them went in favor of Ontario, 19 for Quebec, if we include the success of the Bloc Québécois in the 1993, 1997, and 2000 elections, and 8 for Alberta, or 11 if we have to include the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Alliance. The number of seats are a national problem overall, but Alberta's frustration goes deeper. Before the 1970s, Albertans created the UFA and the Social Credit Party as the Liberals and the Conservatives were not suitable for their realities. When Quebec's separatist movement gained a lot of attention, Alberta was forgotten. Between the 1980s and earlier in the 2000s, they tried to have more representation with the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Alliance, but these parties failed to do so. Under a conservative government, Albertans were satisfied as their demands were heard. When Justin Trudeau won the elections, they feared that it would hurt Alberta's economy like his father did during his reign. I did some research on them, and they were not beloved in Quebec either, but for different reasons. It has a lot to do with their desire to destroy the French culture and their interferences in the affairs of Quebec. Several options have been put on the table to fix this long-term issue. First, Alberta can become an independent country. However, the new country will have to often negotiate with Canada for their borders, since Alberta would be landlocked. Second, join the US, as the province has been heavily influenced by Americans throughout its history. Or third, like the Maverick Party suggested, the 4 western provinces leaving to become a country. These 3 options would mean that Alberta will no longer be a Canadian province. For the proud Canadians in Alberta, the province should remain. Maybe an alliance with all the western provinces, they will gain enough seats to have a stronger voice in Ottawa. A western alliance mean that their weight will be greater than Quebec, but less than Ontario. They will have 104 seats. The solution will allow the federal government to finally listen to their demands, or stay with the same number of seats and find new ways to be heard. With the creation of the Maverick Party, it will be interesting to see if this new party will be able to meet the demands of the West in the next federal election. I explained the movement from an Albertan perspective, as well as I tried to not use false narratives, which explains why the equalization payment wasn't really mentioned. Do you understand Alberta's frustration? And what do you think Alberta should do? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to see more videos. Bye!